It's so wonderful to be here with all of you this evening. A real treat from around the country and around the world as well. Special welcome to Teshin Matt Swager, who is the guiding teacher of the North Carolina Zen Center and a friend and colleague, and to everyone from the North Carolina Zen Center, which is co-sponsoring this event with Boundless Way Zen. Wonderful to have you here. And our good friends Rinsen and Doan, who caused trouble in the Toledo area by leading the Great Heartland Zen Center, the Toledo group out there, dear friends and colleagues as well. And to everyone who came, also the Vine of Obstacles. I know a number of you who work regularly with Dosho somehow have not gotten fed up with him enough and want to hear more. I'll never understand everyone, but here we are, and we are indeed glad to have Dosho Port Rōshi with us. Dosho is a longtime friend of both Melissa and I. By the way, I'm David Reinick, and this is Melissa Blacker, and we are the guiding teachers of Boundless Way Zen Temple. And Dosho, we know him from the years he came and practiced with us, did retreats. Some of you remember that far back. It was in the late 1800s, I believe, when we first worked together. But Dosho is a Dharma heir of Katagiri Rōshi, and also received Inca from James Ford Rōshi, and has been someone that both Melissa and I have admired and respected and felt very close to for many years. Last year, he was with us to talk about his book, The Record of the Empty Hall, and his translation of that. He's been working on translation for a number of years, and I've had some very interesting conversations with him. We say that Zen is a transmission outside of words and letters, and yet there are a lot of words and letters used, if you notice closely. And almost everything we study comes to us in English, having been translated from Japanese or Korean or mostly Chinese. So I asked Dosho if he would talk a little bit, lead us a little bit in deeper to some texts we might be familiar with. Quite an interesting endeavor to look into the intention and the possibility of these wondrous teachings that have been so important for all of us. So with that, let me turn it over to Dosho. One more thing, if you have technical trouble, Corwin, you can use the chat function with him. Other than that, let's not use the chat function unless it's a technical thing. And Dosho has promised that there'll be lots of time for questions and comments and to engage. So, Dosho.
Thank you. Good to be here. And I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint. I'm not really a PowerPoint guy, so I might need help with this. We came on early and tried to set up the PowerPoint, and I think it worked, but let's try again. Here we are, the true intention of Buddhas and ancestors. And as you know, after the Buddha's awakening, he thought about not teaching, because the point that he had realized, his awakening, was so subtle that he thought he might just sit under the Bodhi tree and enjoy his awakening. And then one of the creator deities appeared and told him, well, use your superpowers, and you can see that there are beings with just a little dust in their eye. And so he began teaching. But all of the Buddha's teachings are in translation. The Buddha spoke Magadhi, and there's no Buddha's teachings that survives in Magadhi. So Pali, the Sanskrit, of course, the Chinese, etc., everything's in translation. So translation is a huge issue just generally in the Buddhist tradition. Let's see, I'm getting a little poppy thing. Oh, there we go. But there's a problem. Oh, words, right? And especially when you're dealing with these large periods of time, different cultures, every word is like a picture, and how people see it and use it change over time. Dependent interpretation, I call it. It's very difficult, this whole business of translation, even, between related languages in the same period of time, let alone translations from over the eons, very different cultural circumstances. Let's see. Okay, sometimes it's working and sometimes it's not. Let's go back, because that was supposed to be dramatic. Okay, here we go. Wrong. There we go. Okay. That wrong and relying wants to go together. So, with translation, you can be wrong, but you can't be right. So, it's quite a practice to translate, because every translation is going to pick one aspect. It's unavoidable, and so you can't really be right, especially from Chinese to English, from Sanskrit to Tibetan. There's a one-to-one pretty much relationship between words, but it's totally not the case between Chinese and English, and so you can be wrong. I think we translators are very often wrong, but you cannot be right. So conversations about right and wrong just don't really apply. It's more like, what's the best way to put this? And we'll be looking at Bodhidharma's verse about relying or established on words and letters, not established on words and letters in a few minutes. But we also have this teaching that words can point to it, like a finger points to the moon. Of course, in a sense, the finger pointing at the moon is not it. But you can have a clear pointing and you can have an unclear pointing, right? And the pointing can be going somewhere else. So, although words are like fingers pointing at the moon, still we can try to be as clear and careful with our words as possible to benefit living beings, of course, to point to it, this subtle teaching, this subtle truth of the Buddha. And in my translation work, I try to apply that spirit of Soto Zen that I have trained in, that is about the careful attention to the detail. That's one of the things that inspired me to get going on this work. Also, as we go along, with our initial openings and successive openings through our Zen work, the sayings of the ancients, including the sutras, become the material that we work with to test and clarify our understanding. So the teachings themselves become increasingly important as we move along through the practice. And there's also, I think, there's also this yearning for the ancient way. And Katagiri Rōshi was very strong in this, a very strong sense of yearning for the ancient way. What were the Buddhas and ancestors really telling us? What was their true intention? And he spent his whole life really sitting and studying the Bodhidharma in this pursuit, yearning for the ancient way, subtly clarifying over and over. It's a wonderful endeavor, that in entering and engaging that process, as many of you know. A wonderful way to spend a lifetime, and also it can be of great benefit to living beings. So, the process for tonight. We will look at these things. Dogen's Awakening, the Bodhidharma verse I mentioned. We'll look mostly at the verse for the Mumonkan, so some very, essential things in the tradition here. And then the 10-line Kannon also, which I think is also an equally important aspect of our Zen tradition. Unpack the characters, hopefully look at subtle meanings, and consider some alternative translations. There will be time for questions. I'm a little concerned with this size group that we might not be able to get through the material, and I want to stay focused. So let's just generally hold questions until the end, if you would, which is a little different than we planned, but that's what seems best tonight. I also got kind of carried away with the PowerPoint, so there's a lot to get through. So please bear with me. Out comes. I'm an old educator, so hopefully you will leave tonight having a fresh and nuanced understanding of this process of translations. Of course, we'll be looking at these texts together. And the heart of it, though, is how to embody the true intention of Buddhas and ancestors. That embodiment includes the use of our frontal lobes and intellectual senses, but hardly in any means is it limited to that. So, it all, though, Corwin, as we were talking earlier, comes down to one word. And that word is Saindava, as it turns out. What? So, Saindava is a Sanskrit word that means water, salt, cup, and horse. So it comes up in the ancient sutras, the Parinirvana Sutra, for example, that a king, for example, calls out to his ministers, his helpers, bring me the Sandava. So what do you get, You have to, it's completely dependent on context, whether you know what to get, the water, salt, cup, or horse. And of course, when you're working with a king, they can be kind of quirky. So getting the wrong thing might have some severe consequences. So the one word, Saindava, it's all about context. The Zen folks, of course, took this as a wonderful opportunity for a koan, and it appears among other places in the record of Jiaozhou. The king calls for Saindava, and again, here we go. And Jiaozhou just did that. So later, Snow Cave said the king wanted salt. The courtier brought a horse. This also appears in the Dogen Shobogenzo. The king wants Saindava. Dogen has a whole fascicle on this issue. So, speaking of Dogen, there we have Dogen's Great Awakening. Dogen's Great Awakening, our first text that we'll look into a little bit. And as you may know, here's the story. One day when Dogen was in China practicing with Rujing, they were sitting up all night, every night. They did not lie down to sleep. And Rujing would appear in the zendo from time to time, and he came in at one time and someone was nodding. So it doesn't say so here, but in one of the versions of the story, he took off his slipper, smacked a monk. They didn't have Kyosakus yet, apparently. And he said, the practice of Zen is dropping off body-mind. How can you just wholeheartedly doze? And when Dogen heard these words, dropping body-mind dropped off, he had a great awakening. And he rushed up to the abbot's room, offered incense, and bowed. Rujing said, "Why are you bowing?" Dogen said, "Body-mind dropped off." Body-mind dropped off, body-mind. This is just a temporary ability, teacher. Don't mistakenly give your seal of approval. I'm not mistakenly giving my seal. So I love this part, by the way. It's like they have this, it's like this old couple, right? Yes, you are. No, you're not. Yes, you're in the middle of Dogen's Great Enlightenment Koa. What are you not mistakenly sealing with approval? Dropping off has dropped off. So wonderful story. And then Dogen says, I stopped. And the case ends with this note that the attendant who was present, whose name is Yi Yuan, who, as it turns out, has an important role in this story later on too, said, this is not a small thing that a foreigner could be like this. Maybe a little prejudice. But then Rujing said, among those here, how many have tasted the fist, slothed off or dropped off, composed and thundering? So this phrase, body-mind drop-off, is really at the heart of our Soto tradition, the Saodong tradition as it moved into Japan. And I have very deep resonance with this phrase. When I was first in Japan, traveling with Kategiri Rōshi, and we visited a monastery as Wioji. The teacher there the first morning gave a talk in the Zendo where he several times came back to, I could hardly understand anything. My Japanese, I had a little Japanese then, but he would come back to this phrase, Shinjin Datsuraku, and it just felt like coming home. Yes, but there are a couple problems, a historical problem and a translation problem. The first thing is whether it happened. Some folks, especially some modern scholars, think that maybe it didn't happen because they argue that in all of Dogen's works, the whole Shobogenzo, the whole extensive record, he doesn't tell the story. He doesn't tell the story even in the Hokkyo-ki, which is his journal essentially of his time in China, or in the Zuimonki record of things heard. He uses this phrase quite often, Shinjin Datsuraku, body-mind drop-off. He actually uses this phrase more often than he uses the phrase shikantaza, just sitting. But still, he doesn't have the background story. So that's a little suspicious. And the other point is about what Ru Jing said. Also, in the record, we can't find any other occurrences of Ru Jing saying this, body-mind dropped off. And he's got quite a healthy record. So, yeah, so it doesn't appear. So, you gotta wonder. This wood block print is by Kokyo Hinkle, by the way, friend of a bunch of ours. So the first point, did it happen? Well, although it does not occur in those works that I mentioned, Dogen did write about it and published it in his section of the Record of Ru Jing. And as it happens, the Record of Ru Jing was just published. And this section of the Record of Ru Jing, I just posted today in the Wildflock Zen blog, so you can actually look at that if you want to, Wildflock Zen blog. And by Kokyo Hinkle has translated this section where Dogen talked about Ru Jing's enlightenment experience and 6 of his successors, including Dogen, and he tells that story. And actually that text there is from Kokyo's translation from the record of Ru Jing. And also, and importantly, this guy Yi Yuan, who was the attendant for Ru Jing, was one of those successors, as it turns out. And Dogen's extensive record, the Ehe Koroku, is very big. Like, there's 9 volumes, there's 500 Dharma Hall discourses, a bunch of other stuff in it. It's a thick text, right? So one of Dogen's, not an immediate successors, but someone who trained with him, Guillen, in the 1260s, took this record, this big book, to China, and he found Yi Yuan, and he wanted Yi Yuan to give his authorization, his support of this text. Yi Yuan felt it was like a little big, so he abbreviated it. Went from the 500 Dharma Hall discourses to about 50. Yi Yuan also wrote a preface, and in that preface, he mentions this story of Dogen's enlightenment. So, from the historical point of view, I think that we can kind of put it to rest. Historically, I mean, we've got an independent third-party witness, in addition to Dogen's own writing about it. So I think historically it's pretty sound that, more than how many other third-party witnesses do we have for any Kensho? Even the Buddha's enlightenment. So this is pretty unusual, actually, historically. And then we've got this other source that also cites it. So then we get to the other problem. What did Rūjing say? As I said, there's no body-mind drop-off aside from Dogen's telling. But Rūjing did use a similar phrase, mind does drop off. Now, and this is not just Rūjing's expression, this is a common expression, especially in Chinese Chan, dropping the dust of the mind so that you can see, clearly. That is the dust of the mind that hinders our ability to appreciate our original Buddha nature. So he did use that. It also sounds a lot in Chinese like body-mind drop-off and mind-dust drop-off are very similar. There's a little bit of tonal difference. So the expressions sound quite a lot alike. I'm not going to try to pronounce them. These are hot buttons. I could give you the modern Chinese, but the modern Chinese isn't how the ancient Chinese would sound anyway, so let's not do that. In Japanese, both expressions mean Shinjin Datsuraku. And in the witness account by Yi Yuan, he actually says, yes, this happened. Dogen had this enlightenment experience when Rūjing said, mind dust drop off. So we could clarify the historical matter, but when we clarify the history, we muddy up the story, actually. So it may be that Dogen heard wrong, so Dogen was a Japanese guy. He did study to become a courtier in Japan, where classical Chinese was the language. So from the time he was a little kid, he would have been bilingual. And as you may have noticed in the koan that we walked through, the phrase, the body-mind drop-off, actually comes up 5 times. So in that 5 times back and forth, when you think like somebody would say, are you saying like voice or are you saying void? Which one is it? But they go back and forth and they seem to be communicating. But this happens too, right? It's also possible, of course, that Yi Yuan heard Rūjing wrong. Possible, but native Chinese speaker, kind of unlikely. So another possibility is that actually Dogen heard mind dust drop off, but then in this Saindava kind of way, and as Dogen was prone to do, he might have changed it. So in order to really get at the true meaning of the Buddhas and ancestors, he didn't stay with the letter. That's also a possibility. But basically, we don't know. So the root of the Soto tradition is really something that we don't really we know for sure which way it went. We can be confident, I think, that his enlightenment experience happened, Dogen's, but we don't know what it turned on. And that brings us to the first caution, which is, there we go. It's important to know clearly what's being said before you get creative. And it can take some time, right? In this work particularly. I think when some of us started way back in the 70s, it's like, as I was saying the other day to our students in Chosan, people would after like 2 or 3 years, they'd be like, okay, now let's change everything because now we know what Zen is. But now it's even less time than that. It's like 5 minutes. But really, it takes a long time to clearly understand the message from the Buddhas and ancestors. And then we can transgress knowingly, which I trust is what Dogen Zenji may have been doing. This, by the way, is Prajna Paramita in the background from Alice and Shanae Brown, who's a teacher or student at Dharma Rain. Okay, so that's the first section on Dogen's enlightenment. Kind of would like to stop to see how it's going, but maybe let's do this next section and then we'll take a little pause and see how it's going for you. And this As you can see, seeing nature becoming Buddha. This is from one of the lines in the Bodhidharma verse. So we'll transition now into looking at another essential aspect of our tradition, the verse from Bodhidharma. It is attributed to Bodhidharma, by the way, but probably, well, you know, it could have been passed orally, but the first time we have it in writing was in the 900s, and Bodhidharma was, you know, in the early 500s, so probably could be 400 years later. It is various phrases within this verse do appear earlier in the Chinese canon, but the whole thing didn't come together, it seems, till one of our Rinzai ancestors, Linqi ancestors, Fen Yong, who was, as I said, in the 900s. So that verse, a special transmission outside the scriptures, not founded on words or letters, by pointing directly to one's mind, it lets one see into one's true nature and thus attain Buddhahood. This is a common version, as it says. It kind of, I think it's from Dumoulin, who was actually somebody who's able to write on it there. Okay, are you seeing that? Somebody's writing on the PowerPoint here. Corwin, you got that? Anyway, so this is a translation by Dumoulin, who was a Catholic priest, German Catholic priest, who became very interested in Zen. And so he does, in addition to the translation, which is also really nice, I like it a lot, when translators put brackets in so that we know this is stuff they're adding, so we can see, you know, they're trying to make it make sense for us, maybe do a bit of our work for us, which is okay. It's hard not to do that at all. But actually, he does a little bit more than what he presented. There's actually all of these things here are bracketed. So he added all of this material. And as you can see, just in the black type, you know, those are words that seem to be connected to characters in the original. Everything else is his interpretation of the verse. So, and there are 16 characters in the verse, and in this common version, there are 31 words. So that's one of the things I like to look at. If you got 16 characters and 31 words, you know, somebody's adding some things to help us, right? And you know, it's intended to be positive, I'm sure, but you can't but then kind of push the translation toward a certain meaning, which may or may not be in the original. So that's what it looks like. Much of Chinese poetry, including Zen poetry, for example, the Mumonkan, gateless barrier is it's 4 or 5, sometimes 6 characters, and often 4 lines of verse. So it has this very symmetrical kind of presentation. It's very difficult, of course, to try to do something similar like that in English. You know, it's a different language, but I think aiming at that simplicity is the point of what we're going into right now. So here's the first verse, first line. A special transmission outside scriptures. So 4 characters. This first one is actually kind of important. Dumoulin translates this as scriptures, but there's a different character, we'll get to that in a bit, but there's a different character actually for sutras, scriptures, and he's going from teaching, instructing, or religion, something like that, to scriptures. And the Zen way has much more to it than scriptures. Person-to-person relationships within the Sangha, student-teacher relationships, the body practice. So it sounds like it's just outside of the scriptures, but is it in those other things? That might be the case if you just go with this translation. But the word that's used is actually broader. It's outside the whole field of the teaching. Apart is good. Then we have this kind of special or separate, distinguished, and transmit. So another simple way to put it would be a separate transmission outside teaching. Second line. Not founded upon words and letters. very simple, 4 characters again, not or even don't. Establish or founded is fine. Text and word also is 1 character, and then also a letter or character. And here I think, it's not so much that we're concerned, I don't think, that people get attached to letters, right? Like A, B, C, D. People don't get attached to the meaning of A, B, C, D. But they do get attached to texts, and sometimes whole schools, and there's fighting about which text is primary and what's secondary, etc. So I think that a more careful, in my view, translation would translate this character as texts and then go with the words for this character. So not establishing words and texts. It could also be simpler, just not establish words, texts, and that leaves it to the reader to discern what the meaning is. 3rd line. By pointing directly to one's mind. And again, straight, direct, so that's good. Point, finger, that's good. Human heart or mind, we get all that. It's also, I think, interesting that the human heart can be also can be considered a binomial. It's fine to consider it like this, but it could be considered one together, in which case it's your predispositions, which changes the meaning here quite a bit, that it's a finger pointing directly to your predispositions, to just the way you are. I think David and Melissa are going to like that point a lot. I can't see you guys, but I think I'm thinking of you.
Yep, we love it.
Yeah.
Very simple, direct translation would be point directly, human heart. Also in the Chinese, in the English, we want to have somebody doing something to something. And it's not that clear in the Chinese. So here, point directly, human heart. It doesn't necessarily, maybe it's the human heart that's pointing directly. Maybe it's something that's pointing at the human heart. So the causal relations within the sentence can roll in multiple ways. And the 4th line. And we have see, which is very important. And see, you'll notice also, so it's see like metaphorical also. It's to observe or to perceive. So it refers to all of the senses. See, this kind of see does. And these 2 characters are, as a binomial, the well-known Kensho. So, and then become, realize or accomplish, and Buddha. The one interesting thing here, I think, is become, especially in Zen, is not like becoming something in the future. Become means you are that now. So probably good to have some kind of word that has that connotation. Realize, as in make real, is, I think, nice. See nature, realize Buddha, or Kensho, realize Buddha. Realize Buddha Kensho would also be fine. And then we have the comparison. So special transmission outside the scriptures. I'd suggest separate transmission outside teaching, not founded on words or letters. Could also be not establishing words, texts. Pointing directly, human heart. I'd stay with that. And then for the last line, just see nature, realize Buddha. And the second caution. Adding explanatory text to the original limits the creative possibilities. So keep it simple. So when we have just these, to get at the true intention of Buddhas and ancestors, the more we add to it, I think there's a possibility that the more we cover it, the more we hide the intention of Buddhas and ancestors, because we just see it from our, temporary point of view. So to transmit it to the future, I think it's really important to keep it simple. The precepts are one example. Most of the precepts, the Soto Zen precepts, are also 4 or 5 characters, very simple. And those Soto Zen precepts come from the Brahmajala Sutra mostly, so there's 1,500 years of history there, and through all these different cultures, this very simple way of having the precepts with just 4 or 5 characters has allowed them to be interpreted in many different cultural circumstances by many different people, kinds of people. So the more we add to it, the more we make them culturally specific. And that's a problem in terms of long-term transmission of the Dharma. We don't want, in other words, we don't want to make them boomer precepts. I mean, it's important that the precepts for boomers are boomer precepts, but we don't want to make them limited to boomers. We want younger people, all sorts of different kinds of people, to be able to appreciate and practice the precepts, I think. And again, prajna paramita. So then we're ready to go on to Mu. So this would be a good time, I think, to take a little pause and see how it's going. I've got my sidebar up on top, so I can't really see if people put their hand up, but let's try anyway. Anybody got a question or anything at this point?
Dosho, you can see people's hands if you click on the participants list. And we invite people to...
They'll go up to the top.
Oh, they'll go up to the top of the side list.
Oh, okay. I see Will. I got, yeah.
There you go.
Go ahead.
There we go. Sorry, I was invisible. I'm sorry I came a little late and I've been, but the real question I have is drop off. Nobody that I've heard ever says anything except drop off, but I don't know what drop off means. I mean, do you drop off your kid at school? Or, I mean, what is drop off? Why is it only ever translated like that when actually that isn't entirely clear? What, are there other contexts where we know that word is used? What is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, the word could also be sloth, by the way. So
slough off. Yeah. Okay.
So that's kind of a more gentle. I just actually heard another Kensho story that uses this word. So let me tell you that one quick. It was with Guagu, who is this wonderful Chinese American Chan teacher, right? And in one of his Kensho experiences, it was when his teacher Shangyan was very sick, and they had this long sesshin, I think 7-day sesshins or something like that in a row, and he was there for the first couple. So once the sesshin gets going, they're doing fast kinhin. He's doing fast kinhin. They're almost running. Then there's the bell to stop, but he's just so totally into it that there's no idea even of stopping. So everybody else stops and goes back to their seats. Guagu starts just racing around this big hall in Taiwan, and just racing around. Finally, he just stops, and the timekeeper suggests that he go sees the teacher. So he goes up and sees the teacher, who is not Chen Yang. He was too sick. And he knocks on the guy's door. He comes, opens the door, and Guagu tells him a little bit about what was going on. And his older Dharma brother says, "Drop it!"
Huh.
So he did. And had, a little taste of great enlightenment. So maybe like a koan, what is drop off? Somebody else. Aaron.
Andres raised his hand before I did.
That's
Go right
okay. I'll
ahead.
call
Thank
on
you.
people.
Go
Go
right
ahead, Aaron.
Oh, okay. While I was watching the characters go by, I noticed like some of them are different words when they're paired. And like for the character is remarkably similar to the character for school, one of the characters for like school.
Right.
And so there can be like connotations of things like that with these words together, or with, when they're like one little different from something else, and that, just barely changes the meaning. So I guess my question is, have you worked with a native Japanese speaker looking at these, or a native Chinese speaker, like kind of working in tandem on this?
I have done some of that, and mostly I use dictionaries very carefully. So especially the Buddhist dictionaries that are available now are very helpful because, yeah, some of the, so binomials can appear, and there's also characters that are transliterations of the Sanskrit. And you might be going along thinking it's talking about something, but it's just using the character for the sound rather than for the meaning. We'll come to one in a moment, which is Namo, and in Chinese, that's to take refuge or homage, and the characters for it are South Mu, South No. So it's just, it doesn't have anything to do with the with that. It's the sound they're transliterating. So yeah, binomials and also being very careful with dictionaries is very important in this work. Yeah. Let's leave it there and move on, and we'll come back to other questions at the end. So if it still applies, and also you can ask those of you who had your hands up, and also I encourage you to, if you have something you want to talk about, you can contact me afterwards. Would be wonderful too if we run out of time. And we've got about 40 minutes left, and we've got both the Mumonkan and the 10-line Kannon. So I better get going here. David Shujo thought that I had too much material. So the Mumonkan, as you know, even a little dog has the Buddha nature. No. Couple things that are interesting here before we get to the verse. First is this little character here, which is in red, which is a cause. And you have Zhao Zhao's name here. You have that he's Venerable Osho. These are the characters for Osho. Then you have cause, and then the monk asked. And in English, the way we like to do it, a monk asked Zhao Zhao, right? So a monk is doing something. In the classical Chinese, particularly, you have this important thing here that it's a cause, and this cause is a very important Buddhist concept. So it's Zhao Zhao who caused the monk to ask. You could say Zhao Zhao caused the monk to ask, or because of Zhao Zhao, the monk asked. Something like that. It's kind of, it'd be strange to say that in English, but it's important to know that's the context, I think. That's where it's coming from. So it's about this relationship, actually, and that this construction allows or points to the relationship dynamic much more than I think the English does. Then what did the monk say? Here you have dog. This is little. It can also be a noun suffix, so it doesn't have to be translated, but it can be. It's a diminisher, so there's a possibility that it's not just a dog, but a little dog. So that brings up the interpretation. How do you see what's going on here? Does that fit? Even also there is Buddha and Buddha nature. Also no. So you have yes and no within this same sentence. You have presence and absence within the same phrase, which also then is taken up in the full koan when Zhao Zhao answers yes and no. Zhao Zhao no, or mu. So this is Katagiri Roshi's mu, by the way. And then there we go. So this also, just the dialogue here and the structure of the Chinese, I think changes a bit the meaning or the context of this central case. So the way I'd put it, even a little dog has the Buddha nature, no and no. So it's more like, it's not so much like, does a dog have Buddha nature? No. No. It's more like a wave meeting a wave. Even a little dog, even this little dog has the Buddha nature. No. So there's just this very lovely intimacy that's in the actual words that can be missed in the translation. So let's look at the verse. First, we'll look at two examples of this really important verse, and there's quite large differences in these verses, and it's one of the reasons I got into this. This actually was one of the first things I worked on, was a translation for this verse. wondering what was the true intention of Buddhas and ancestors. And R.H. Blythe, old-time translator, and oh my goodness, do I feel for these old guys that were working on this, back in the 50s and 60s. It's amazing how the work that they did. So I may be critical, but that's after 50 years of lots of processing that people have been able to have. So we're standing on the shoulders of these giants, really. So his verse, the dog, Buddha nature, perfect manifestation, the command of the truth. If for a moment you fall into relativity, you're a dead man. That's interesting. So then we have Aiken Rōshi, dog, Buddha nature, the full presentation of the whole. With a bit of has or has not, body is lost, life is lost. That's a mu by Hakuin. So quite different. What is the true intention of Buddhas and ancestors? Let's look at the characters. So this mu, by the way, and we'll have a, I think, clearer picture that's coming up next, was from Kono Bukai, who was also a successor of Dokutan Rōshi, who was the Soto monk who brought the the Koan tradition into our lineage. And here we have it. Okay. The four characters, again, very simple. Dog, little, Buddha nature. So from the case, grounding us there, again, four characters. The whole thing put forward. Upright is this third character, or command, imperative. In the third line, this first of all, only or just, and then cross over, enter experience. So we have crossover, which is a kind of a transcendent term, and enter or experience, which is kind of imminent. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at that character in just a moment. Then again, we have yes, no, absence, presence, have not. U and mu, by the way. And then finally, the last line, four characters: die, body, lose, life. Very simple. And my rendering, little dog, Buddha nature. I have, emphasis here that also R.H. Blythe does. There's no such marks, of course, in the original. So that's a little interpretive on my part. Confession. The whole put forward, the exact imperative. Only enter, yes, no. Drop body, lose life. So then this character, Sho, in Japanese, Sho. And the original usage of this character suggests a sense of wading across the body of water, and you can even see that a little bit here, like it's like this is the water and there's a person crossing through or over the water. So it has this crossover sense. As I said earlier, it's also to experience or enter, to be involved in. So you could here have either a transcendent translation or an imminent translation. And how are you going to choose, And how you choose is going to have quite a large impact on the meaning of this verse. This verse is, right at the core of our koan tradition. So examples would be, you could translate it as only cross over, yes and no. Only transcend, yes and no. You could say only experience, yes and no. You could say only enter, yes and no. Only be involved in, yes and no. Only wade through, yes and no. Oops. And by the way, I now, I've been going with only enter, yes and no for quite a while. But now I'm into only wade through, yes and no. Because it has both the immanent and transcendent possibilities. If you just go with crossover, yes, no, it sounds very transcendent. Only be involved in, maybe too immanent. So only wade through, maybe comes most closely to the nuance that's used originally here. And this is a mu by Tangen Rōshi, Tangen Harada Rōshi, whom some of you either know or know of. And back to the comparison first with Blythe. Dog, Buddha nature, pretty much the same, pretty perfect manifestation. the command of the truth, I just find a little bit odd. The exact imperative, I prefer. Let's leave it at that. If for a moment you fall into relativity, you'll see the translator here has added quite a bit. He's made it conditional with the if, just a little if there, for the moment. Maybe he's pulling out only for a moment, but there's no moment that's actually mentioned in the characters, so it's a little funny. And then fall into relativity. Maybe fall is for that Wade character show, but there's no relativity really. He's interpreting yes and no as meaning relativity, and maybe yes, maybe no. It changes the meaning of the verse, I'd say. And also, you are a dead man is quite a leap. Actually, there's the gender issue there, of course, which maybe we could forgive him for in the 50s doing his work. But there's no man or person there. It's drop body, lose life. It goes back to Shinjin Datsuraku, just a different expression of the same phrase that led to Dogen's awakening, possibly. So, and then let's look at Robert Aiken's translation. Dog, Buddha nature. This is Muman Yamada's Mu on the side, by the way. Little dog, Buddha nature. That's Robert Aiken doesn't have the little, which of course fine. We're in alignment, pretty good. Full presentation of the whole. He does an interesting thing here. I mean, this is a very nice phrase in English, I think, the full presentation of the whole, but he drops out the exact imperative. I can't see where he's using that part. The full presentation of the whole seems mostly of the first two characters, and I think he's dropped off the last two. With a bit of has or has not, that's Aiken Rōshi's. And as I said, I'm going with this one tonight. Body is lost, life is lost. So with a bit of, it sounds more prescriptive, and it could be just descriptive, I think. Only enter yes, no. When you only wade through yes, no, you drop body, lose life. So it also, like many of the translations, are pretty hard on yes and no. And the original, I think, can be seen as being very tender with our way of being into yes and no, and not like suggesting to kill it, as I said. And our third caution. This is the first one, really, even if you know what's said, and keep it simple. Practicing awakening is necessary to express the tradition within the tradition. This is probably the most controversial caution that I have. And it's impossible, because we've got very few people that are deeply trained both in Zen and in the traditional Chinese or Japanese. And to make matters even more, unrealistic, I guess, this expectation is that it's also really best if you have a committee working on this, because any individual person's individual proclivities can lean the translation one way or another, and it's really important, and that's how it was done classically in ancient China especially, that there would be a small group of people that would work together and balance each other out in that way. And some of those translations, which we'll get to in a moment, have lasted for 1,500 years. So, amazing accomplishments by, these ancient ancestors of ours. So this would be the best case scenario. And between now and then, I think we're just, doing the best we can with some understandable, limitations. All right. So now we're going to go into the 10-line Kannon. And this is Hakuin's painting of Avalokiteshvara, or Kannon. No land not manifest. And I don't think it's possible to overemphasize the importance of the Avalokiteshvara, the compassion figure, in East Asian Buddhism. Avalokiteshvara, Kannon, became a very central figure in many ways, and especially for common people, householders. but it's also present, also in the Japanese tradition, both in Rinzai and Soto. The longer version from the Lotus Sutra, the chapter of the Lotus Sutra on Avalokiteshvara, the Universal Gateway chapter, it has a text and a verse, and these are chanted alternately. Is the first thing chanted in Soto Zen. They're also chanted in Rinzai Zen. They're quite long. There's 653 English words for the Universal Gateway verse. And this is just one little portion of it, which Hakuin used here in his painting, fully endowed with miraculous powers, widely practicing wisdom and skillful means in every land, in all directions. In no realm does Avalokiteshvara not appear. So this chapter was considered a separate sutra in China and just called the Kannon Sutra. It just really captured the imagination of the Chinese people. Very powerful. I think it's one of the ways that our global and particularly Western Buddhism is quite different from the received tradition, is that we don't emphasize our roots in the compassion teachings as much as we could. And one of the reasons, by the way, probably should have waited for that slide, but one of the reasons for that, there's a lot of chanting. For example, the Heart Sutra. I once asked Katagiri Rōshi, why was the Heart Sutra the first thing translated? And he said, because it's short. There's like 50 characters, and to do the verse of the Universal Gateway, we'd wind up with 653 words. We didn't have time. So we just did what we could do. So that emphasis on more of the wisdom teaching, and the Heart Sutra is more than that, of course, but on the wisdom teaching is more of an accident in this translation and transmission from east to west. The origin of the 10-line Kannon. So there's numerous stories like this, but one of the older stories, probably from the 500s, a guy named Wang got in trouble with the powers that be, and he was going to be executed. And he went to sleep, which is interesting, but in his dream, a man came to him, it says, and said to him, if you recite the Kannon Sutra 1,000 times, you will be spared from execution. And in the dream, kind of like Dogen, I think, at Rujing, he's like, I'm going to be executed in the morning. It actually, to chant the Kannon Sutra, just the verse, according to my calculations, it would take about 3.5 or 4 days to recite that 1,000 times. Can't do it. So the guy in the dream says, "Oh, okay, good. I'll teach you the 10-line version." And the 10-line version, you can chant 1,000 times in just a few hours. So maybe 4. But so he does. The guy wakes up. Wang wakes up. He chants the sutra, and just as they're going to bring him to the execution, his pardon arrives. So the 10-line appears in many of these ancient stories. There's many, many stories that involve miracles with the chanting of the 10-line. And so it's a brilliant sutra, actually. It has this devotional practice, the Nenbutsu. Nenbutsu is the mindfulness of Buddha, or thinking Buddha's name. Sometimes it's called Nen, we'll get to in a minute, and Butsu. And so it's a mindfulness of Buddha practice, with Kanzeon being the Buddha figure. It's also a samadhi or absorption practice through that repeated invocation of the phrase. It's also an insight kensho practice, which is very important and I think often missed, and we'll get to why that is in just a moment. And it's also instructional at the same time it's performative. The 10 line is actually not explanatory. So it also really fits with this kind of everyday life thing. It's not this long thing that goes on and explains all these Buddhist concepts. It does it. It does Kanzeon. Also, the 10 line isn't really about compassion as karuna. It's about great compassion, which is different in scope and agency than karuna. In the Western Buddhism, often we also conflate compassion, which is a feeling, with great compassion, which is not exactly a feeling. And we'll get into that because that's what this whole 10-line thing is about. I was talking with Mado Moore about this and my understanding of the 10-line, and he said, well, it's a concise deity yoga visualization. I was like, yep, that sounds right. Yeah, that's what it is, actually. And at this time also in China, the what we now refer to as Tibetan Buddhism was also very widely practiced. So there is that kind of mixing in this teaching. It also comes from the grassroots, which also I have affinity with, being a kid from a lower class family in northern Minnesota. I also like that. So it comes from dreams, from householders. There's a movement also through especially the Kannon teachings generally, and in these stories about the miraculous appearance of Kannon, where this person comes in a dream. At first they're just someone, as in the story I told. Then later on, they become a monk, kind of a strange monk appears in these dreams. And then later it's a woman in white. And that also parallels the development where that Kannon came into China male and became female in China and then spread through East Asia in that way. So this gender movement from ancient times is right here in the story of this Bodhisattva. If you're interested in more about Avalokiteshvara and in China, this is an excellent book, The Chinese Transformation of Avalokiteshvara. And Guagu, who's somebody who really knows his stuff, is recommended that book to me, and I've been reading it and recommended it to you. Here's what the sutra looks like. Again, there's a symmetry to it. First 2 lines, 3 characters, then 4 characters, then 5 characters. And this is also a Kannon by a 19th century figure. And we just have time to just hear a teeny bit of this, but let's do that because this is a Kannon practice keeps morphing. And I bet some of you have heard this, and I trust you can hear it now. You'll get to Akasaka. You'll hear it here. One go through. This is wonderful. It's available on YouTube, of course, if you're interested in it. I think that they do a wonderful job there of getting the spirit, the feeling of that devotional practice very, very powerfully. So let's see what we can do here with going through the 10 line. First, of course, look at the title. First we look at the whole thing. Here we have it. Kanzeyan namu butsu yo butsu in yo butsu en bukpo so en jo rakuga jo kanzeyan bon en kanzeyan nen nen ju shin ki nen nen fu ri shin. That's the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese characters. And here's one way to do it in English with a lot of loan words. Kanze on Namo Buddha. Namo Buddha, one with Buddha cause, one with Buddha affinity, Buddha Dharma Sangha affinity, constancy, joy, self, purity, mornings nen kanzeyon, evenings nen kanzeyon, nen through arising mind, nen not apart from this mind. That's our Vine version. There's 42 characters, 37 words. Of course, the characters are more syllabic than words, than the English words. Also, traditionally, this verse is understood to have these first 6 lines to be about their definitional sense of what kanzeon is. And then the last 4 lines are about the practice. So these first 6 lines are the qualities of the Bodhisattva, and these last 4 lines are about the practice of this verse. And now the title. So 10 line, pretty straightforward. These 2 characters actually were added in the 1700s, the enmei, the life prolonging part. It used to just be the 10 line Kannon in the 1700s, the 1600s in Japan. That was added. So just so you know, this thing keeps changing. And this, Guan Yin, that's where we have our non-dual wisdom coming in, very important. So Guan or Kan in Japanese just means to observe on honest sounds. Observe, but this character for observe also is vipassana. So it's to analyze or investigate the principle of things through non-dual wisdom. In other words, to be the sounds. So the 10-line Kannon Sutra is the 10 lines of being the sounds sutra. That's what this is. And that's what great compassion is. And then we have sutra. And sutra, as you may know, has to do with this warp, also threads. And so from threads and warp and things being threaded together, the word is used for classics, and Chinese picked it up for Buddhist texts as well. Then let's go through the line by line. Kanzeon, observe world sounds. Now you'll notice that the title is Kannon, and then in the first line we seem to have another name, Kanzeon. The Kannon is simply the abbreviation of the fuller term, but it's interesting, and I think part of its grassroots origins, that the informal name is in the title. Then you also might know that Kanjizai is another bodhisattva, another way of saying the Avalokiteshvara's name from the Sanskrit. And it has to do just with which translator was working on it, as it turns out. Kumarajiva, great translator in the 4th century, he liked this way of parsing the Sanskrit, and so you get this observing world sounds. But a later figure, Xuanzang, who is the translator who put together the Heart Sutra, he liked Kanji Zai. So in the Heart Sutra you have Kanji Zai Bo Satsu. That's same figure, just a different way of understanding the translation issues. It's unhindered observation, I think, which is also important. So, second line, Namu Butsu in the Japanese, Namo Buddha. So there's all sorts of loan words going on here. And the Chinese didn't translate this, Namo. They just left it in the Sanskrit, and I suggest that we do the same. Namo means to take refuge in or homage, but neither of those are as strong as the original word. And so Namo, though, Katagiri Rōshi, this guy, and speaking of translation, we got the baseball cap, he said that it should be understood as to throw yourself into Buddha. Refuge and homage, like maybe, but they're kind of soft. And also, frankly, Namo is better to chant, so that's one of the reasons I selected it. It's a lot easier to chant than refuge or homage. Third line, one with Buddha cause, Yo Butsu in. together. This is also sometimes translated as practice. I saw Mark here earlier, and his Dharma name has this character in it. Buddha, there is, and cause. This is the same cause in the koan in the Mukoan with Jiao Jiao. So one with Buddha, cause. Many ways you could put this together, looking for something that expresses it in a really unified kind of way. And fourth line, one with Buddha affinity, Yobutsu en. Again, we have the same first three words and another word there. Together, this character from the third line and this character from the fourth line, very important concept, inen in Japanese, that has to do with cause and effect or affinity. In Buddhism, more generally and technically, the first is a direct cause and the second is a secondary cause. So one with Buddha both in terms as a primary cause and secondary cause. And then, and by the way, for those of you into the Zen koan tradition, this is also often used just to refer to a case, a Zen koan. It's the causes and conditions. And so that's seldom used in English, but it is there frequently in the Chinese. And then the fifth line, Buddha Dharma Sangha affinity. So that affinity, that secondary cause, arises through Buddha Dharma Sangha as kanzeon, as this non-dual hearing the sounds of the world. Buposoen and affinity. This, by the way, is Yvonne Rand, a mentor of mine who had the greatest affinity with Dharma teachers of anybody I've ever met. She was Suzuki Roshi's secretary when she was young. She studied with Katagiri Roshi, she studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, Lama Toko, etc., etc. She just had this kind of magnet that would bring her to really great teachers, and she studied with most of the great teachers of the 20th century. She was an amazing woman. Sixth line, constancy, joy, self-purity. This line is often translated quite differently, and it's getting better, but often we have the 4 marks, right? Permanent suffering, non-self, impurity. Often when people were looking at this verse and translating it in the early days, they would go like, what? Self? It can't be self. No, I mean, we have non-self here. We don't have self. But actually, we do. So the 4 marks of nirvana, constancy, joy, self, and purity. So these 4 marks were taught by the Buddha in the Nirvana Sutra. It's one of those times where the Buddha could see that if he brought this up, there were people that are going to have a hard time with it. So he kind of gave him a warning, like, I'm going to say something now that maybe some of you should leave. So, and a bunch of people got up and left because it's like too much. What? We've been studying impermanent suffering, non-self, and impurity, and now you're throwing this at us? But it's there. That's what's there, and not non-self, and for a good reason. Yeah. 7th line. Yeah, I'll touch on another nuance of that in a minute. 7th line, morning's nen, kanzeyan. And pretty much straightforward, but we have this new element introduced, nen, which I brought up before in terms of nen butsu. It's the remember moment or thought, and morning nen kanzeon, as we talked about. Here's nen. This is causes shin, and the character for nen is composed of 2 parts. This is now, and this is heart or mind. So the now heart. And this practice of Nembutsu, particularly with Namu Amida Butsu, is hugely powerful in both China and in Japan, calling Buddha's name as a samadhi practice and devotional practice. And this sutra, as I said, has roots in that tradition. Nen itself most commonly means study today, but it also means remember. Katagiri Roshi preferred remember. Remembering the Dharma. It's also the character that's translated as mindfulness, probably way too much. I prefer nowfulness, but so far that has not caught on. Let's look at the 8th line, evenings, nen, kanze on. Pretty straightforward, very similar to the previous line. And the ninth line, which is quite important because we have this nen through a rising mind. And the nen together, two nens, to remember, suggests the continuous prajna samadhi, the continuity of prajna samadhi. And it's not so much like thinking and thinking, it's continuity of prajna samadhi. And in this line, nen through a rising mind. And then the 10th line. And this, by the way, is Mayumi Oda's Kannon. Nen not apart from this mind. There you have it. Some of the same characters we've had earlier. And comparison, I think I will just do comparison 1, given the time. This is Aiken Rōshi, by the way, and this is not his translation. This is a translation I couldn't find who did this one. It's appears several times around the internet. Kanzeon, paying homage to Buddha. All right. And we have forged causal relation, karmic affinity. We got that in there. And I'm going to focus on my comparison with this one, given the time, and then we'll probably have time for a question or two. Kanzeon. Oops, I was playing with this earlier, and it looks like I didn't get them to quite line up. This one should be up there. You can see that, Namo Buddha. So paying homage to Buddha is quite different, actually, especially when you add in the word paying. You know, it's definitely like there's something out there, right, that you're giving something to, paying homage. That, I think, isn't really the spirit or the characters of the original. One with Buddha cause, they have forged, and maybe they're pulling that from the connective character, but forged seems a bit funny, and also like there's two things. One with Buddha affinity, same kind of issue there. Well, mostly that's fine. They have ease here, which I think is way too light. You know, it's joy, it's the bliss of realization. So much more than ease. In the morning, think of Kanzeon. So you've got three things here. You've got a time, you've got an activity, and you've got something outside. And the meaning of the characters as I read them are this is the non-duality of morning nen Kanzeon. It's the non-dual hearing of the sounds of the world, right now. Same with the evening. And then thought after thought. Also, it's like, this is kind of nice. You feel like, oh, my thoughts are Kanzeon. Oh, that's nice. But that's not really what it says. It's about the continuity of non-duality. That's what it's about. It's not that that's not true, but it's just not what is said. And nen is not apart from this mind. I have here also, but I'm not going to go through this. The one, this is a version that I know that a number of centers use, and it was by Hogan Bays, but he didn't try to translate it. He tried to interpret it, and they do sometimes use it at Great Vow, but they use it with a different title. And Hogan said, "Yeah, it's kind of what I thought it meant like 20 years ago, but we don't use it that often anymore." So if you use this version, I'd actually recommend that you don't, because it's different very much so than the original characters. And we don't have time for it tonight. Be happy to talk about it some other time. Fourth caution: even if your head would split in 7 pieces, don't translate out complexity. That's my keep it simple and don't translate out complexity. This is my aspiration. So let's run through the 4 cautions again. This is what I suggest for translation work. Know clearly what is being said before you get creative. I think that applies to Dharma practice generally. Adding explanatory text to the original limits the creative possibilities. You know, the deeper we are, the better our translations are going to be. And don't translate out complexity. I hope you have some kind of fresh understanding of these texts and the process, and it all gets down to Sain Dava. And David Shujo taught me how to do some of this stuff. There you go. So we wiped the slate clean.
Wow. So now we'll move into the exam part. We have a test for everyone. No, we actually don't have time for questions, but Dosho, how wonderful. I wondered what you've been doing in Nebraska all these years. And now I know moving up to northern Minnesota now for more solitude. But thank you for offering your heart, your great enthusiasm, and a love of the way communicates as you talk, and opening this wondrous world to us in so much detail. So we're so delighted that you've been with us tonight. Let's sit for just a minute together, letting all of this settle just for a moment.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming from wherever you came from. So wonderful to have people from all over the worldwide Zen community. And if you're interested in communicating with Dosho, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
If you're on Facebook, you could message me there at Dosho Port, and email to vineofobstacleszen@gmail. It's a good way.
Great. And you're inviting people to do that?
Yep.
Great. And for those of you who are guests tonight who aren't part of our Boundless Way Zen community, now you know how to get here. You're very welcome. We sit 8 times a week and sometimes more. So please feel free to come. And this, as we said, was a joint project from Boundless Way Zen and the North Carolina Zen Center. So we thank, there they are in their Zendo. And just what a treasure it is to be able to practice the Dharma together. Let's be grateful and bow to each other.